The insane Karen story where she steals his house, leaving him homeless and hospitalized. Can he claw his way back and reclaim his property? Entitled Squatter Tried to Steal My Brother's House, posted by Caring Sister NCA. Several years ago, my brother, Dan, moved from California to Washington State and built a 3-bedroom house on one of 2 parcels of land that he had bought when he was 18 years old. He lived in a nice community with a small lake and had an HOA. During the 2008 economic crash, he ran into financial trouble, so we helped him. To repay us for the help, in March of 2016, he came down to California for an extended period to work on our house, which was neglected because of helping him. He was very proficient at renovating houses, and he did fantastic work. In November, my brother's friend, Jake, called him and asked if a friend of his, Tuna, could stay in one of the rooms for $400 a month. Dan had worked for many years with Jake doing construction for a house flipper, so he trusted Jake's judgment. He needed the money, and he thought it might be good to have someone trustworthy there to help watch over his house. Dan drove back up to Washington, cleaned out a room, put a lock on his bedroom door, he locked the door, and put some of his things in a storage area up out of the way in the garage. Tuna seemed nice and gave Dan $400 for the first month. There was never a written rental agreement. It was just verbal and meant to be temporary because Dan was going to return in 6 months. Tuna never sent another payment. We would call and we would ask her, and she always said it had been sent, but nothing ever arrived. So, what was going on at his house? We pieced together that something wrong was going on there after Dan's neighbor called and after questioning Jake. The neighbor complained that the house had turned into a drug house full of people and cars coming and going all hours of the night. At the beginning of June 2017, Dan drove back to Washington and handed Tuna a 3-day eviction notice. She left, stating that she had somewhere else to live and would get her stuff later. He was allowing her to retrieve her stuff at a later date. He just wanted her out. He started working on repairs and cleaning up the house. I mailed Dan a care package with some clothes, a California-themed shopping bag, and some gift cards for gas and food. 5 days later, Tuna showed up with 2 men who punched Dan in the face. They wanted to take the house back by force. Dan went to the neighbor and called the police. The police came, and instead of arresting the men and Tuna, they took Dan to jail for missing a child support court date, which then put a warrant on him. Before coming to California, he thought everything regarding child support back payments for his independent, successful 23-year-old adult child had been taken care of. He had no idea about a court date since they notified by mail, and Tuna had never forwarded his mail, which was one of the things that she promised to do. The child support scam on Dan is another issue I'll have to submit later. So the police essentially handed the house over to Tuna. She and her cronies went in, changed the locks, and placed a long metal bar across the inside of the garage door so it could not be opened from the outside. They stole the package that I sent to Dan, and then they spent his gift cards. Meanwhile, my family and I were on vacation in Hawaii, and I received a phone call from Dan in jail. I spent the whole day of my vacation in the hotel room trying to figure out how to get him out of jail. Bail bonds could not be used for child support cases. Finally, they let him out when I paid a child support payment of $350. He had been in jail for 3 days, and the squatters had dug themselves in. So when he returned to his house, he had to call the police to arrest them for trespassing. After all, Tuna had been evicted, left, and no longer had permission to be there. They were squatters by all accounts, but the state defers to people who just claim they are renting, therefore requiring a landlord to go through the court system to remove the so-called tenants who were actually squatters. The police came and screwed him over once again. Tuna claimed she was renting the entire house, and the police believed her instead of Dan. She told the policeman that she would leave in 10 days, and the policeman told Dan that he could have his house back in 10 days because Tuna said that she would leave by then. Are you kidding me? Dan was instructed to leave the premises or be arrested. It was his house. She was trespassing. He got into his minivan and drove away with nowhere to stay but in his van. Of course, Tuna did not leave after 10 days. Dan went back after the 10 days and he called the police again. Once again, the police told him to leave or be arrested. We didn't know what to do next. One of the HOA board members, who had some experience in managing real estate properties, they attempted to help us. She said that he needed a 20-day eviction notice and then Tuna would be out. And this had always worked for her when she had to evict tenants. Okay. So the 20-day notice was posted and we waited. Tuna did not leave. Dan went over to his house and started cleaning up the trash strewn all over the yard, waiting for her to leave. Tuna called the police, stating that she was a renter and he was disturbing her. Once again, Dan was asked to leave or be arrested. This time, Dan put his phone on speaker and I heard the whole interaction between him and the police. Yes, he had to leave or be arrested. Dan could not even get his construction tools out of the garage and could not work without his tools. And with being homeless, how do you even work? What was going to happen to all of his possessions, his sentimental things? His room had been broken into long before, his things removed, and people had used the room. It was near the end of summer. We were paying his mortgage payments and it was getting so hard on everyone. And then something nice happened. A kind friend, Adam, asked him to stay at his house, which Dan did. During this time, Dan worked for Adam with loaned tools and also went to some landlord and tenant educational meetings. The people at the meetings were helpful and instructed Dan on how to proceed by taking the matter to the court. The police would not go further without a court order to physically evict Tuna. It would be difficult to afford the cost to hire a lawyer, but eventually we did end up getting a lawyer. Dan posted a court appearance on the door of his house, since Tuna never answered the door, and that is what you do legally in this case. Every time he posted a court appearance, he had to legally give her 1 week notice, which he did. He showed up at court and Tuna failed to show up, so he won by default, right? Wrong. The judge said that Tuna was not given proper notice because the notice was posted by Dan instead of an anonymous person. Dan walked out of the courtroom. The lawyers from the landlord and tenant meetings were there and they couldn't believe it. Unfortunately, Adam had to move out of his house that he was renting, so Dan had to go back to living in his van. It was autumn in the Pacific Northwest and it was getting cold. The police had started harassing him if he slept in his van. We rented motel rooms for Dan, and once in a while at the motel, Dan heard a knock on the door in the middle of the night. He thought it was the motel staff and he opened the door. 2 men burst into the room and proceeded to beat the crap out of him to rob him. They broke his finger and gave him a concussion, and then Dan ran to the van, drove it to a parking lot, and slept. He refused to go back to that motel. Things were starting to go downhill in a very bad way. I found a lawyer from a nonprofit who worked for free to help. He actually used that 3-day eviction notice that Dan had given Tuna back in June as a basis for the case. I had found it online, the wording was appropriate, and it had been served properly. The lawyer had to jump through endless hoops in court appearances, and the same judge presided over every case that had to do with evictions, and she always had favored the tenants, including the entitled ones. This took forever, like 3 more months, and Dan became haggard and homeless, sick and depressed, and at times had gone missing. Once, I called every hospital and jail, homeless shelter, and even the food bank looking for him. His van was impounded 4 times, and he was hospitalized 4 times. He was endlessly hunted down and harassed by the police. 3 times I found him because I was listed as his emergency contact on his state insurance when he showed up at hospitals. While all of this was happening to Dan, my husband was in a serious motorcycle accident, and I had to take care of my husband, changing his dressings and so on. Okay, I am crying right now. This was so hard to endure, remember, and difficult to write about. I couldn't leave and fly up to Washington to help my brother, but I was doing everything down here to get his house back with the lawyer. I got him motel rooms at other motels when I could, and I paid 4 times to get his van out of impound. I sent him cell phones and care packages delivered at UPS stores. One time, Dan was lost and didn't have his van or phone. He ended up at a hospital who contacted me. He told me that he had felt really sick and had gone to the hospital earlier, who released him after examining him, even after he pleaded with them to let him stay because he felt horribly sick. He ended up collapsed on the sidewalk by the Salvation Army shelter, who wouldn't let him in, and another homeless person called 911. So, he was back at that hospital with a very serious condition affecting his heart. I told the hospital to please call me at release time so I could arrange a motel for Dan. They didn't. He was then found in a park in frigid weather, dressed in a pair of scrubs, a t-shirt, hoodie, and 1 shoe. A city policeman called me and took him to a motel where he stayed a while, and I sent a care package there. Dan told me that one time when he was being harassed by the police for cooking food in a park, he mouthed off and told them that they were communists and it was their fault that he was homeless because they gave his house to a squatter. A fire truck arrived, so he was not arrested with the firemen there, but I don't think the police liked him very much for saying that. In October, Dan was arrested for drunk driving while he was sleeping in a Walmart parking lot. What? I had to bail him out of jail over that? Every time that he didn't get to court hearings, they would post warrants for his arrest. One time, he was in jail and they refused to give him his medication, so I had to bail him out because he felt so awful. In mid-November, the police arrested Dan again for not showing up to court for that so-called drunk driving incident. He begged me to bail him out. And even though the bail bondsman paid the bail in the late afternoon, the jail released him in the middle of the night. Again, with no vehicle, it was impounded, a dead cell phone, no charger, it was in the van, no money, and so on. I found out later that this jail only releases people at night so they can get credit and are paid by the state for the whole day. That night he was released, it was our deceased mother's birthday. Dan was then found unconscious in a ditch by a seawall in a Starbucks parking lot. He had a broken femur, broken hip, cracked spine, and a head contusion, and that finger was still broken from the motel incident. The doctors evaluated that he had been hit in the back of his head with a blunt object. We don't know who did it. The last thing he remembers was a police car driving by. He was airlifted to a major hospital in Seattle, about 50 miles from where he was. I took a flight up to Seattle as soon as I could and I visited him. The doctor showed me the x-rays and he had countless rods and pins put into his body to help put him back together. By this time, we were getting closer to having his house back. I went by the house with Adam's brother-in-law, Paul, who was packing heat. We pounded on the door and I demanded that the squatters hand over my dead mother's rocking chair. The stupid friend, Jake, he was there, and he handed it through the door. It is a big heirloom mission-style chair, and they had burned into the chair in 4-inch letters the word wasted. The court order finally became available, but then we had to schedule the eviction according to when the police had the time to do it, which was another 2 weeks. It was scheduled for the beginning of December. I went back home to California briefly and I returned the night of the eviction. Dan was in the hospital for almost 2 weeks. When he was released, I arranged a nice long-term stay type hotel back near home for him to live at until the police evicted the squatters. Paul helped us a lot. He was with the police at the eviction, changed all the locks, and secured the house. He picked up Dan at the hotel, and Dan got to witness the eviction of that entitled witch from heck. She was the only one left in the house. A notice had been posted on the door to warn everyone to leave, but as usual, she didn't think there would be any reason that she would have to leave. It took her completely by surprise. The police pounded on the door and demanded that she leave immediately. She asked if she could get this and that, but no, she couldn't. She grabbed her little dog, her purse, and left with nothing else. The police put a notice on the door after Paul had secured everything. Dan was driven back to the hotel, and then I arrived. I wished that I could have seen the eviction, but I couldn't get a flight early enough. The neighbors said that a bunch of people came to the house that night, pounding on the door trying to get in, but they couldn't. They almost called the police, but the people left. We went over there every day for about a week to clean up. Dan was confined to a wheelchair and was on heavy meds, so it was hard. He couldn't help too much, but he did his best. The house was a disaster. There was literally 5 tons of garbage in the yards around the house. The trash disposal service was not activated during this time, so they just piled it up around the house. On one side of the house was a huge pillar of trash made out of wire fencing. It was about 8 feet by 8 feet and at least 12 feet high. The front yard was awful, with several piles of trash about 4 feet high. Tuna left every single thing in the kitchen, in the cupboards, and rotting food in pans. The carpets were soaked in dog pee. There were clothes and junk everywhere, and there was loads of crushed glass embedded into the gravel driveway, like she wanted us to get flat tires. Over the doorway from the house into the garage was a dangerous booby trap, which literally could have killed someone. It was made out of large heavy metal clamps with a glass jewelry case teetering on top of the clamps. It could have fallen on top of someone's head if not discovered, and someone jarred it a little. The water had been shut off for months by the HOA because they controlled the well and owned the water system. As soon as you don't pay the HOA fees, water is shut off. All the toilets were clogged up with crap. The sewage system was impossible to unclog, and later DB discovered that they had thrown dirt and plastic containers down the pipe. He had to go under the house and disassemble the pipes to get everything out. Hanging up on the wall in plain sight in the master bedroom was the California shopping bag that I had mailed to Dan in the package that Tuna had stolen. She hung it there to taunt me. I am not super religious, but I felt the worst kind of evil there and had to pray and debunk the evil spirits from that house. I stayed for weeks there cleaning up and hired some people to do yard clean out to get the front yard clean. Later, Dan and Adam dealt with a pillar of trash at the side of the house. Every construction tool that belonged to Dan was stolen. He couldn't work much from a wheelchair, but needed the tools to repair his own house. Dan persisted, though. He finally got to the point where he could walk. Now, he can't walk for long periods, he gets tired easily, but he can do things slowly. He has some nice roommates that drive him places and take care of him at times. Many of his tools have been replaced. He sanded off the wasted message on Mom's rocking chair, too. We have sunk a lot of money into helping him, but what else is one supposed to do? It was a life or death situation. That was his house that he had built so many years ago. This was the most wicked thing that I have ever encountered. It was coming from all directions. We heard that the creepy squatter died a year later. No one wanted to take her in, and she went from person to person, staying wherever. If she would have been decent and kind, she probably could have been a roommate and had a place, but she thought she could just take someone's house. In a crazy twist of events, when asked if OP thought that the police and judges were co-conspirators in this case, OP replied, "We did suspect that often. You wouldn't believe what a hard time they gave his lawyer, who followed all the protocol to the T. Someone wanted his house, and we weren't sure it was even the squatter. My first time reading this story was the live read as I read it for the recording, and I never expected it to get this crazy. Hospitalized and everything. I hope everything is okay now, OP. What a story. The HOA president sells my house from behind my back when I'm away, and I'm not even part of the HOA. Be sure to click the video on the screen. You don't want to miss the fallout. This one's crazy, and I'll see you there.